Hey, everybody. We're delighted to have Tanvi here in Chicago, and I'm delighted that we filled the house. We're also, for the first time, co-sponsoring this with the Committee on Southern Asian Studies here at the University of Chicago, this being a talk on India and all. So we thank them for doing that with us, and it's the first time, since there are probably I see some unfamiliar faces and some people who probably came through the Southern Asian Studies angle. This is a monthly series that we do. It's a contemporary China series, so the focus is almost exclusively on China. We do politics, we do the economy, we do foreign policy, we've done national security, we do some arts and culture occasionally. And it's usually China domestic or China focused, but we have occasionally, Tanvi, tried to take a look at China from the perspective of the neighborhood and kind of look back at China through the eyes of neighbors and others rather than just at China through a domestic lens. From my recollection, we've really only done that twice. Once was a look at the China-Japan relationship. We had the great Ezra Vogel from Harvard, kind of a legend in the East Asia field, and a switch hitter on China and Japan, come and talk a little bit about China through Japanese eyes and vice versa. And then our friend from Washington, Victor Cha, has been here talking about China and the two Koreas. And that talk was a lot about China, but Victor also took a look at China through Korean eyes as well. But India, to my mind, is a whole different story entirely. It is an emerging economy like China. It is a large continental-sized country. It's mastered the nuclear fuel cycle. It has a large, growing, and fearsome arsenal of strategic nuclear weapons, and it has its own ambitions in its neighborhood and in Asia as well. And so it's a different kind of interaction and relationship with China than, say, the South Korean interaction and relationship with China. And that's one reason why we wanted to have Tanvi come out and talk a little bit about how India views China now, but also because under Narendra Modi's government, I think a lot is actually quite in play in terms of the way India views China, but also dynamics in the relationship. I can't think of anyone better to do this than Tanvi, first because she's looked hard at the India-China relationship through your academic work, but also running the India program at the Brookings Institution in Washington. But also because you're an expert on Indian foreign policy and on India itself, not just on the India-China relationship. The one thing I will say from my perspective, I just think it's an interesting time, we'll see if you agree on this, because the India-China relationship kind of encapsulates some things that I think are interesting and have broader patterns and implications in Asia generally. One is the complicated collision between economics and security. And in relationship after relationship that you see between both emerging and advanced industrial Asian powers with China, Japan is an example, Australia is another, South Korea is another, and frankly, India is another. You have relationships that are really fraught on the security side, where there's enormous ambivalence about the rise of Chinese power, and where some of China's choices have, to put it bluntly, scared their neighbors silly. But the scope and scale of economic integration and interaction has expanded apace as China's outbound investment and trade profile in the region has expanded. So, other than Japan, it's hard to think of a country in Asia that's more ambivalent about the rise of Chinese power than India these days. And yet China is India's #1 trading partner in goods, for instance. I think if you throw services in, it's still the United States. So there's that dynamic, kind of economics and security and collision. Second, there's the sort of Asia writ large with the sub-regional dynamic, where you have China pushing out both as an economic player, but also as a security player into various subregions of Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, in ways that begin to push on the interests and equities of the traditional dominant regional powers in these neighborhoods. That's certainly the case. I mean, China's always had a unique and interesting relationship with Pakistan, for example, but you're starting to see China's economic presence and security presence in places like Bangladesh or in Nepal or in Sri Lanka in ways that 10, 15 years ago had a very different configuration at best, and in some ways were really unthinkable, certainly when I was working on South Asia in the government. So there's that, and then you also have the flip, which is as countries around Asia become more ambivalent about China, you have the reality of, as we said, another large continental-sized Asian power with a large arsenal of nuclear weapons and a large military and some projection ability, continental strategic tradition, but nonetheless a naval presence and a pretty forward-thinking and looking Indian Navy. And so India has become more relevant to the calculations of other countries beyond South Asia, not least in Southeast Asia, as a country that has potential and actual effects on the strategic balance vis-a-vis China. And so that dynamic is interesting too. I think China pushing into South Asia in various interesting ways, but also India's growing role beyond the boundaries of South Asia. And you have an India that economic growth hasn't really enabled that by helping it to explode the boundaries of South Asia and get beyond the confining shackles of that geography. And last, there's this kind of action-reaction thing that Tanvi and I were talking a little bit about before. Most of my career has been with China, but I was, for a little bit of time, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia in the Bush administration. So I was kind of day-to-day doing a lot with India and Sri Lanka and other countries. And at that time, India's government, it was the last government, the UPA government, UPA 1, actually, not the second term. I mean, definitely had an approach to China, but in my ways, to my mind, I found it much more reactive in some ways than what I've seen out of the Modi government, and particularly the first year or so of the Modi government, where Mr. Modi's agenda seemed very much focused on growth and development in the Indian economy. And so interesting questions about whether and how to harness China in terms of investment and economic interaction to India's own domestic agenda, I think evolved in interesting ways in 2014, 15, 16 that I hadn't really seen before. And in a way that's kind of interesting because it's a more active and less reactive stance than I think we've seen from India. And I also see some of that on a security side too. But Tanvi's the real expert on this. And we're thrilled you came out here, particularly the University of Chicago, because it's such a great center for India studies and South Asian studies. So we're very cash here, so we'll have you come up, talk for 30, 40 minutes, a little bit about Modi and India and China, and then do your own Q&A. We've got a very lively, interactive audience usually, so don't be shy. Don't be shy, and let's have some fun. So Tanvi, welcome to Chicago, and over to you, okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Evan, and thanks to all of you for coming as well, and to the university and the institute and the Southern Asian Studies Center as well. It's great to be here, and it's great to also, Evan's great to engage with on this because there are not that many people who actually think about, and this is weird because there's been engagement between South and Southeast and East Asia, but you often don't get to have these conversations often. These days now, a lot of talk about India, China, but they're all kind of these, I mean, with overlapping peripheries, but a lot of overlapping issues as well. There's a lot that we can talk about, and I'm happy to talk about kind of a broader array of issues related to India and China, their role in the region. But what I thought I'd do here is kind of talk about where things are in terms of the Modi government's approach to China policy, and particularly kind of where the US fits into his approach and his strategy. Just kind of stepping back, though, on kind of India's relationship with China. And when I think about elements, I always think about it as you have the good elements, the bad elements, and the potentially ugly elements. And so what I'm going to talk about is the good and bad, and we can talk about how they might potentially turn ugly. But I'm going to talk about them in the context of developments since May 2014, when Prime Minister Modi took office. And there was, as Evan suggested, I think you saw a lot of the good, positive signs initially. And when Prime Minister Modi took office, there was a lot of expectation that despite some of his campaign rhetoric, which people set aside, including in China, there was a lot of expectation. Not just in India, but in China as well, that the good side of the relationship would dominate. And the reasons for that was that Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, had engaged with China quite a bit, had been to China 3 or 4 times to attract investment into Gujarat, but also kind of opportunities for Gujarati exporters. And so this was somebody that a number of people thought, we can do business with this guy. And on his part, he'd indicated that he wanted China to be part of the Indian growth story. And he had run on, amongst other things, creating jobs, having better infrastructure, and to kind of talked about growth and development kind of more broadly. And there are only that many countries that he thought could specially help and particularly help on both the kind of developing a bigger manufacturing base in India and developing infrastructure. And he had looked at the Chinese experience. He was very admiring of what the Chinese leadership had achieved on the economic side, always added when he talked about it that, okay, we can't do necessarily all of this in a democratic context, it's different, but liked what had been achieved by this other large Asian country. The first indications when he came to office were that this positive, this kind of upswing was going to dominate. There was a lot of outreach from China. Premier Li Keqiang was one of the first few leaders to call him after he took office. Wang Yi became the first kind of major international figure to come to visit him in India. They announced that President Xi would go to India for his first visit that fall in September 2014. On India's part, you saw visits in quick succession from the Commerce Minister as well as the National Security Advisor. And you also saw something that didn't get much notice at the time and frankly even doesn't to this day, which is when Prime Minister Modi first met the Dalai Lama as Prime Minister, and all Indian Prime Ministers do, much like President Obama in 2009, he downplayed the visibility of that meeting, which was a departure. And it was partly done because President Xi was going to visit in a month or so. And so the indications were that this was going to be kind of, there was going to be a lot of a positive approach, kind of cooperative, and a lot about talk about the potential for the relationship. When President Xi went to India, the Prime Minister broke protocol, or at least tradition, and went against some of the recommendations of his foreign ministry and went to receive President Xi in Ahmedabad, in Gujarat. And that and we saw a lot of talk about economic cooperation during that visit. And since then, we have seen some cooperative sides. Just to give you a few examples on kind of the diplomatic engagement side, there's definitely been kind of a higher level and more frequent numbers of engagement between the two countries, including at the end of that first year. Modi had promised that he would visit China before his first year was out, and he did in May 2015 when he went to Xi'an, Shanghai, and Beijing. There's also, they've been talking about, they have a dialogue on counterterrorism. They continue to do some military exercises, though not as sophisticated as the ones between the US and India, for example. But there were a range of kind of security issues that the two have been talking about more recently. They also discussed issues like Afghanistan, which is a fairly recent development, is just a few years old. It precedes the Modi government, but this was something that was talked about as well. You also did see on the economic side that trade started picking up again after it actually fell. So people often used to say, well, China, India, the trade relationship has been growing. And for a while, that was actually not true. There were a few years in between when trade actually not just stalled, but fell. But then it's picked up again in the last few years. And as Evan said, for India, China is, at least in terms of trade and goods, its largest trading partner. The investment relationship has been kind of, it's not been as great as, for example, China's in outgoing investments with other countries. It was quite minuscule. It has actually tripled, if not quadrupled, but it's still kind of in the billions, like lower billions, rather than, you could even think about tens or hundreds of billions in other cases. But it has picked up. The other interesting area that doesn't get much attention is on the mergers and acquisition side, and particularly Chinese companies investing in or acquiring Indian companies, including Indian startups that they've been investing in. You also saw cooperation and have seen on the positive side of kind of the ledger, cooperation in the multilateral sphere. So you saw China, you've seen China welcoming Indian membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India will officially join this summer. You saw the continuation of the Russia-India-China trilateral, as well as, again, in those initial months, India kind of going along more or less with the Chinese and Russian positions at the BRICS summit. India was also joined formally the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It was a founding member and is the second largest shareholder. And this goes back again, not just to working with countries like China, but also something that China and India continue to work on together, which is call for a greater role and representation in international financial institutions. But this also goes back to kind of the Modi government's belief, and particularly Prime Minister Modi's, that you have to have sources of investment in the infrastructure sector, and particularly not as an alternate to the traditional banks, but as a supplement in those cases. But having said all that about the positive side, you really you have seen kind of the bad in the relationship, so to speak, dominate at least the headlines and to some extent the interactions in the last year and a half or so. If you look at any kind of descriptions of the state of the relationship, particularly when you see it from the Indian perspective, you hear words these days like strained, stressed, tense, turbulent to describe the relationship. So what happened? Now, some of these signs of strain and kind of where they've evolved to precede the Modi government. They go back to kind of a 2008-2009 period when not just India but a number of countries saw some Chinese behavior as being too assertive, as kind of not being aware enough of Indian sensitivities on some issues, for example. And we can talk about kind of those things from 2008, 2009 in greater detail in Q&A if you'd like. But kind of more recently, and in the Modi government's context, from Delhi's perspective at least, I think it also goes back to some seeds that were sown in that first year of the Modi government, which was bookended by the leader-level visits. So you saw during Xi's visit a border incident that took place with PLA troops crossing over the boundary and setting up camp. Now, this happens a fair bit because the kind of boundary is undemarcated there. But usually there's crossing over and then the sides move back. In this case, they didn't. There was a debate, is this deliberate? Was this a local decision? Was it central? Whatever the reasons were at the time, what it did is it put Modi to some extent on the back foot. And, for example, particularly on Indian television, which doesn't tend to look at China in a very nuanced way, you saw a split screen with Prime Minister Modi kind of going out of his way to greet President Xi, and then kind of the border incident that was happening at the time. And you heard kind of the line that, well, see, no matter when good things happen, there will be a betrayal or something to that effect. There was also a sense on the part of some that this was essentially a way of testing Modi out in the beginning. But regardless, this did kind of, you saw the change in tone by the end of that visit, where instead of kind of the joint statement was supposed to be very heavy on the kind of economic cooperation side, you saw statements, and particularly the unilateral statements that both sides made. The Prime Minister's statement that he gave at the end of that visit essentially said that yes, there would be economic cooperation, but earlier it used to be, well, economic cooperation was going to help us deal with some of the political issues. It would lay the groundwork. This kind of changed the formulation in his statement. He said economic cooperation would be possible, but it would be limited if there wasn't understanding of mutual sensitivities and of Indian sensitivities as well. And so you did see some of that change in tone. The second thing that happened that kind of bookended that year was just before the Modi visit. You saw kind of a Xi visit to Pakistan, where he not just kind of went kind of had a full-throated endorsement of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and what made this sensitive for India wasn't kind of particular projects per se, but the fact that at least some part of it, when you look at the connectivity part of it, was going through territory that India claimed in Kashmir. And so that kind of, those two things, and there's this kind of picture, famous picture of Modi probably sending kind of officials on both sides in a tizzy in Xi'an, taking Xi by the side under, I don't know if it was a banyan tree or not, but essentially taking him aside. And you saw on that visit, again, the tone changed, and you saw, and to some extent it didn't happen at the time, it wasn't kind of spontaneous, but you saw after that Pakistan visit, you saw Modi do something that Indian leaders had not done in the past, which was actually talk about differences publicly that China and India had, whether it was trade, whether it was, without naming Pakistan, relationships with third countries, but saying essentially the same thing that was said on a previous visit, that you have to respect sensitivities first, then we'd move on, or at least we could move on in parallel things, but there would be a limit to how much the two countries could cooperate. And those kind of bookended concerns, the kind of border issue and the China-Pakistan relationship, and the CPEC and instance and what happened to that, they essentially reflected the two of the outstanding issues in the bilateral relationship. If you think about them, these are not issues that have just suddenly come up. They've been ongoing. One was, of course, the border dispute. But the second was kind of this broad relationship that China has with Pakistan that, from India's perspective at least, over the last few years has been deepening. And that has been worrisome for them, because not in terms of that this is suddenly a relationship that they have to grapple with and never did before. This has been developing since the 60s. But because of CPEC, it is bringing China to India's west in a way that it hadn't in the past, physically, potentially. And again, some of this is potential, it's not actual. And some of this is concerns rather than, or anxieties rather than a reality right now. But the second thing that it was, for the longest time, and to some extent, it's still an imbalanced relationship between China and Pakistan, with China holding all the cards. In this case, because this was going to provide, at least as it was envisioned, to some extent, connectivity between China's west and the Arabian Sea, that this did give Pakistan a few more cards to hold, that now suddenly you saw Beijing doing things that earlier it had held back on, like blocking Indian membership of the nuclear suppliers group and blocking the designation of some terrorists based in Pakistan at the UN. And essentially, the thought was that this was being done for Pakistan and not for any particular reasons that China had with India on a bilateral basis. After all, didn't necessarily want this, had been taking a strong line on counterterrorism more globally. Now, there's the flip side of that, which people argue, well, this was also came in response to India getting closer to countries like Japan and the US. And so this was kind of an action-reaction, as Evan talked about. I'll come back to that in a bit. But beyond Pakistan, there is also concern to some extent in India about increasing Chinese activity in India's territorial and maritime neighborhood. Not entirely, but in large part as part of some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, but not entirely in that sense. And so you've seen over the last few years greater engagement, particularly economic engagement, but also political and military supply or sales arrangements with countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And it's not I think you'd find, at least in government or in the Indian government, there is a recognition that they can't exactly ask these countries to A, make a choice, but B, give up the opportunity to also take advantage of the China growth story to contribute to their own growth story, because that's what, after all, Modi said he was going to look to China to do as well. But what has been kind of, especially more recently, the concern about what the impact of these economic engagement was going to be on these countries' political and strategic choices. And so there's watched with some concern the use of economic leverage to shape options, whether economic, political, strategic, not just in Nepal and Sri Lanka, but also looking further afield at South Korea and Mongolia and what's been happening there. In turn, China has been concerned about India's growing kind of relationships, not to the same extent. I think China always looms larger in the Indian mind than the opposite. But there has been some concern expressed as well on India's increasing relationships, not to the same degree as China's relationships with India's neighbors, but with India's relationships with China's neighbors, including in Southeast Asia. but particularly with Japan and the US, and in Southeast Asia, particularly with Vietnam. And so you have seen, and people can, you can go back and track what came first. Former National Security Advisor Shankar Menon said that when the nuclear deal between the US and India was signed, there was awareness that this would have an impact, an effect on India's relationship with China, because China would see this as kind of India tilting. And so you have seen kind of India and China's relationship starting to be affected by some of these kind of other relationships that they've had. There's another issue that is kind of, if you kind of leave the neighbors aside, that is also sensitive for the Chinese, which is the question of Tibet and the presence of the Dalai Lama. And we're going to see that come up again, I suspect, sometime early next month when the Dalai Lama visits Arunachal Pradesh, which China claims as South Tibet, and particularly his visit to Tawang, which for various reasons is kind of a sensitive point for both countries. The other thing that had happened in the last 2.5 years or so, which kind of has put this emphasis on, or at least in terms of how people are seeing the relationship on kind of the bad or the negative side of the ledger, was that some of the issues that were supposed to kind of alleviate some of the stresses, things weren't going all that great in them. On the economic relationship, two issues in particular. One, from India's perspective, the trade deficit. So even as China is India's largest trading partner, China also contributes about kind of 2/3 of that is 2/3 of India's, or close to 2/3 of India's entire trade deficit is its trade deficit with China. And that has become, now you do have Indian economists saying, well, that's partly because of manufacturing problems at home and some of the kind of strains in the Indian economy, or kind of in terms of the limits of production, etc. But regardless, this has been a very sensitive subject. But the second thing which both countries complain in terms of each other is limited market access. Indian companies, like a lot of American companies do, talk about limited market access in Beijing for some similar reasons, not entirely the same. Chinese companies used to complain about that because some areas were closed to them for strategic reasons. They were put under kind of India has a version of the CFIUS process that essentially they weren't allowed to invest in certain sectors. Now, Prime Minister Modi, when he had first come, did kind of ease not just kind of some of the restraints on companies like Huawei, but had also eased the visa regime for Chinese businessmen and women and tourists. But regardless, this market access issue and complaint has continued for both sides. The other issue that was seen kind of issue area that was seen as kind of an area of cooperation, which was the multilateral sphere. You saw problems in this regard as well, which is on issues like cyber governance. You saw India kind of move to more kind of a centrist position, not quite along with countries like the US or the Europeans, but essentially move away from what was the Russian and Chinese position that emphasized multilateralism versus kind of multi-stakeholderism. And that was something that was largely domestically driven in India. It wasn't really necessarily an international, kind of an outside-in perspective. But those areas had created kind of bonds as such. But the other thing you saw is one of the things that India and China in the multilateral sphere had emphasized is the need for international institutions to reflect the kind of current state of affairs in terms of global power structures, and that both China and India deserved a larger role. But as India saw, it saw kind of the current, at least on the political side, in institutions like the UN Security Council, like the Nuclear Suppliers Group, it saw China as actually preventing its entry into these institutions. And this became this has become part of this broader narrative that you've started to hear in India, which used to be said about the US, that you used to hear this in the 80s in India, that the US was out to prevent India's rise. You hear that being said, not necessarily in government, but you do hear it said kind of and it starts becoming a kind of a reinforcing theme, which is that China is not ready to give India space or create space while it is asking everybody else for space for its own ambitions. But this is also an underlying problem, I think, in the relationship that is kind of a chicken and egg situation, that there is a lack of trust and frankly a lack of knowledge about each other, that each reinforces the other. And you do see this problem. You've seen the governments try to actually address some of this. They've started kind of more exchanges between their medias. You've started to see them try to kind of get more scholars to visit each other's countries. But there is this underlying kind of lack, I would say, of knowledge of each other that reinforces some of these problems. And it doesn't really leave, when things go wrong, there isn't really a constituency that's coming out other than the government and trying to temper things down. So given this, where there is a cooperative side, but also a competitive side that's been more in evidence recently, what has the kind of Modi government's approach been? It's been kind of multifold, and I'm going to talk about where the US fits in this, and we can talk about it more in Q&A, and I'll try to finish this quickly so that we have as much time as possible for question and answers. One of which is building capabilities. I mean, in an academic sense, you could call it internal balancing, which is building capabilities on the economic side, and on the military side, both conventional and nuclear. Now, what's interesting about this is India sees both China and the US as playing a role in helping it build those capabilities on the economic side. It also sees the US as playing a role in it helping build the military capabilities that it needs. Now, I will preface all this in terms of the approach by saying this is the attempt. One of the challenges is that India hasn't always succeeded in terms of getting some of this stuff done, but this is kind of the effort. You also see, along with kind of building capabilities at home, thinking about neighborhood outreach and a focus on the neighborhood, and I'll kind of define the neighborhood in kind of three ways. One is continuing engagement with China to actually create more linkages that will give China an incentive to maintain a good relationship with India. The second is it's not a new engagement, but kind of emphasizing or re-engaging with India's smaller neighbors, so Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and not just engaging, but a realization that India needs to deliver on its own promises. Its track record hasn't been great to actually deliver on the projects it's promised, on some of the agreements that have been made but not delivered on. And so that's kind of a second aspect of the neighborhood engagement, almost to create, not asking these countries to make choices, but ensuring that India still can shape some of their options by continuing these linkages. The third aspect of this neighborhood is kind of the extended neighborhood. China and India, as I said, have overlapping peripheries, and so engaging with kind of, and to some extent with economic components, but also security components of an approach towards Southeast Asia, particularly countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, and Singapore, some of which India has had kind of more traditional relationships with. But now you're also starting to see a little more engagement with countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. The kind of third tier of India's approach has been building a network of partnerships to essentially kind of knowing that it cannot maintain a certain balance of power in Asia, or kind of not quite, Indian government officials will always say this is not about containment, but about, you hear them occasionally, at least privately, say about creating balance in the region. Cannot do it by itself. And so creating a network of partnerships, including with the US, a former senior Indian official has called the shared concern and uncertainty that the US and India have about Chinese intentions and some actions. He's called it the strategic glue in the relationship. Now, you can argue about whether, and I think he was saying it's not the only glue, but it is the strategic glue in the relationship. And so you've seen that with the US. You've also seen kind of a Prime Minister Modi who has been quite explicit that he doesn't buy an Asia for Asians line. He used, in a speech, a public speech he gave, he said, when I look east, and that was kind of India's, the erstwhile policy, it's now called Act East, but he says, when I look east, I see the western shores of the United States, that he sees and wants a continuing role, US role and presence in the Asia Pacific and even the Indian Ocean region. Now this is quite unusual in terms of a public statement of this, and you've seen this in the last few years. If you know Indian history, the usual thing used to be, at least publicly, the line was that external powers should kind of stay out of the region and they're creating problems between the countries. Privately, they would say something entirely different, which is why India was always very concerned when the US withdrew from Vietnam, for example, but would never say that publicly. But again, emphasizing now this desire to have the US be engaged in this region, signing of a joint strategic vision statement for the Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean regions between the two countries that laid out, and there was then a roadmap with mixed kind of implementation of on some of the fronts. Also kind of more upgraded maritime exercises and military exercises more broadly, bringing Japan in on a more regular basis into the US-India naval exercise. Also kind of engaging with the US in a trilateral context with Japan's, which is in the trilateral, India-Japan-US trilateral, has been upgraded now to the ministerial level. But India also at the same time, while it is doing this with the US, is also engaging with US allies and partners, particularly Japan, but also Australia and South Korea. There's an Australia-Japan-India trilateral, but also kind of a lot of developments in the bilateral relationship with these countries. Again, particularly Japan, because of what it can offer economically, in particular, but also strategically. I'm not going to talk about that in details. Happy to answer questions about those relationships in particular. But the other relationship in terms of building a network of partnerships that often doesn't get much attention in thinking about India's approach to or how to deal with China and this concern that it has about China is India's relationship with Russia, which it has always seen as part of its ability to kind of balance out the China relationship. So it's been quite concerned about China and Russia getting closer. On a regional extent, in terms of the fourth aspect of India's approach, is one of India's trying to show up more, particularly in Southeast Asia. There was always a complaint, still is to some extent, that India wasn't showing up. And you've seen it be slightly more active in some of the regional summits like the ADMM+, which is the defense ministers meeting, and take a more active role. You've seen higher level leaders going to these summits and more consistently showing up. But it's not just showing up, it is speaking up to some extent. Now you can say that this is actually adding to India's problems with China, but it is speaking up, for example, on issues like the South China Sea. It's of course not a claimant, but it has emphasized in not just a unilateral context, which it has done even in the previous government, but with the Modi government has started emphasizing its position on freedom of navigation, lack of non-use of force, and a consultative mechanism. It's been saying kind of essentially including this in joint statements with claimant countries, including the Philippines and Vietnam, but also with countries like the US. It's also been, and the US has done this and India has done it as well, which is pointing to India's arbitration with international arbitration being used by Bangladesh and India accepting the results of that as kind of a model. I'm going to end with kind of some challenges ahead for India as it thinks about not just engagement with China, but also kind of some of the challenges in terms of this approach that it's been taking. One is in terms of actually getting to a better balance from where we are. How do you de-stress this relationship? We're currently in a phase where there is very much, sadly, after that first year, we have got into a bit of an action-reaction phase, and it's not quite clear. You can start to see some attempts at ratcheting some of this down, at least the rhetoric, at least some of the bringing the temperature down a bit. But it is we're still in that phase where how do they get onto an off-ramp? And that is something I think they'll probably have to work on. And this is happening while they're cooperating on a range of things. But there's a lot of action-reaction on the negative side. The second is, as India is thinking about its kind of the more competitive side, there is a massive capabilities gap between China and India, both on the economic side and on the military side. And that is an issue. And in terms of building capabilities, India's got a long way to go on that front. Third, if you think about India's relationship with China, it is a fairly asymmetrical one, whether it is in terms of kind of trade, whether it's in terms of investment, whether it's in terms of M&A activity, but also on some of kind of the other elements, it's a fairly asymmetrical relationship. What this means is India now has to really think about and do an assessment of what leverage does India have with China. China has, you could say market. Today, Xiaomi announced that India is its largest kind of overseas market, so you can say market. You can say that, preventing, if India said that it would be willing to limit that it wouldn't do certain things with countries like the US or Japan, for example. So it's kind of a more defensive line. But this question of what leverage does India have? The third thing that I think is a problem for the bilateral relationship is needing to actually get this, there's a lot of talk of connectivity, and I'm happy to talk about not just kind of the Belt and Road Initiative, but some of India's connectivity projects that it's engaging with Myanmar, with Bangladesh, with Thailand. But the two countries, the connectivity between them, and actually just physical connectivity, is pretty bad. If you think about whether it's road and rail, but planes, there is no direct flight between Mumbai and Shanghai. There is not a daily direct flight I think it's 5 days or 6 days a week between Delhi and Beijing. And there are probably 5 or 6 direct flights between Delhi and New York, or just cities in the US more broadly. And so this is a real problem in terms of if you're going to start to engage more to try to create a better understanding of each other's sensitivities, of just basic knowledge, of greater business, simple things like better connectivity matters. And so far we haven't seen that much on that front. The other thing in terms of India's dealing with its neighborhood or in Asia is the Indian Foreign Secretary used this line in a different context, but it's apt for this, which is intentions does not equal outcomes. Which is India has talked about engaging, whether it's with partners, whether it's in the neighborhood, but it has to deliver. This, across the board, when you think about Indian policy, delivery implementation has been an issue, so getting that right is a major challenge. It can be done, but it has to be a focus. There's also another challenge, and there's just one more after this, and then I'll stop. But something that Evan talked about, which is India in some countries, it's part of the economic story, but not the security story. In some parts, it's the opposite. But in Asia as a whole, it hasn't really been a huge part of the economic story. And so can you really have an approach to the region if you haven't thought about a regional trade approach, about how to become a greater part of the supply chains in Asia? In some areas, auto parts, for example, India is very much part of it. But in other areas, it is not. So how do you get to be part of that, which will also help create connections and leverage with not just China, but a number of other countries in the region? Finally, a major challenge for India moving forward. And I wouldn't say major, I think it depends on what happens. But is uncertainty now about the US approach to some extent. There's no panic, but there's uncertainty about the US approach and level of engagement going forward in the Asia Pacific, particularly towards China, but in the Asia Pacific more broadly. And that's starting to raise kind of a set of issues in terms of if India has thought about the US as part of its kind of China strategy, and the US approach is uncertain, what does India have to do to make up for it? So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really thorough. So my question is regarding your point that around 2008, the relation got a little, it worsened. So can you talk a little more about what the issues were regarding sensitivity, and did the asymmetries emerge after that? And was the relation smooth before that?
So I think, do you want me to take a few, or I'll answer? So the relationship, I think, has not been smooth since the 50s. To some extent, even when they were outwardly smooth, they were sources of strain. But really, since the 60s, particularly bad for a while, they didn't even have kind of full diplomatic relationship, the relations after the 1962 Sino-Indian War. You did start to see some re-engagement, and then particularly kind of in the 80s with Rajiv Gandhi, you saw some effort even with Indira Gandhi, but you did see things starting to come back. Prime Minister Vajpayee's visit to China was a departure as well. Things started to become better, and I think especially in terms of the economic opportunity, and you did see from a very low point of something like $2 billion in trade in 2000, by kind of the 2014, 2015, it was up to I think $65 billion. So now, if you think about this in terms of U.S.-China numbers, it's nothing. But just in terms of the jump, and given the history of both countries, so it got smoother. It's never been entirely smooth. What happened in kind of 2008, 2009? I think in the India-China context, it was a combination of things where you did see instances, for example, like China starting to staple visas in the passports of kind of Kashmiris, not allowing a general who was from, I can't remember if it was in Arunachal Pradesh or Kashmir. And so there were kind of these things that combined with a sense in India that China, which had not endorsed kind of places like Sikkim or Arunachal Pradesh as part of India, but didn't it wasn't taking some of these actions, or with regard to Kashmir, that some of these things started to get played up. Now, there were also things happening with every other neighbor, so there was a sense that post-financial crisis and a broader sense of Chinese confidence, the Olympics were held, that 2008, 2009, 2010 period, there were a number of things. Now, you could also see it as that 2008 was when the nuclear deal went through, and kind of from the Chinese perspective, that essentially said something to them about the US-India relationship, or India's choices as well. In the mid-2000s, you had seen China actually back away from a kind of full-throated endorsement of Pakistan's position on Kashmir. And you saw that going backwards after kind of this period. So there was quite a few things kind of that reinforced the sense that this was some of the things that hadn't gone away. They were there, they were dormant, they came back to the fore. So those were some of the issues. And we have since then, I think there was an attempt to do, I know the word reset these days is not, there was no reset button, but there was an attempt, I think, an opportunity in that first year of the Modi administration to get out of that cycle that had started in about 2009. But sadly, we've, I think, gone back to that a little bit. And so that's the challenge now, is how do you get out of it, and how do you get back to that phase? So I think I've answered all your questions. You had 3, right? Or you have 3-part question. Please.
You mentioned CPEC and how China is more involved with Pakistan and Afghanistan. So how do you see China's role in the eventual resolution of Afghanistan? Will they just back the Pakistani position? Will this be a tension point between India and China?
So it's interesting because in some senses, if you think about it, most countries, China, India, and the US included, have an interest in the end goal, stability in Afghanistan. The problem comes that there's not necessarily agreement on how you get there and what that stability, what's going to bring that stability in terms of what kind of government brings it. So I think there are differences. China has made efforts. In fact, it was seen as one of the signs of them getting more involved politically in the kind of neighborhood when they did kind of, whether it was persuade Pakistan, but kind of get the parties together. But the concern that India has is that not so much that it necessarily go along with Pakistan, that China would find acceptable a Taliban government and it has the leverage to persuade Pakistan to bring the Afghan Taliban to the table. And India doesn't share that view, that a Taliban government in Afghanistan would be good for the country or regional stability. And so I think there are differences on that, but I do think, and there is a dialogue. I don't know if they've recently held an iteration of it. There is an understanding. I mean, after all, both countries also had investments in huge mining projects that they essentially had to abandon. It was also quite convenient for both countries when the U.S. was, providing the underlying security for that. And so some of the things, I think China, you did see it getting more involved, particularly as the Obama administration talked about kind of withdrawal. But I think Afghanistan is probably less of a concern than I think for India than China's relationship with Pakistan. Now, I think CPEC is one area where you also see differences between the U.S. and India, because I think there is kind of a view that if China's greater interest and engagement in the country could get them to care about what the domestic kind of stability within Pakistan looks like, that'd be a good thing. The development, if this contributes to Pakistani development, more electricity through power projects, better road connectivity internally, then this is a good thing. The flip side, which India holds, and there is the issue of kind of where it goes through, and you've seen indications that and you've heard Indians say this, India should not complain about Chinese connectivity projects, which the government has officially called, without naming China, unilateral and non-transparent, not just the CPEC, but others. But that if you put aside kind of the Indian view that this goes through territory claims, a broader concern that this will entail kind of a deeper connection between the two countries. It would potentially, though, depending on how kind of the debt picture plays out, and that's been much in the news recently, there's a lot of debate within Pakistan about CPEC as well, and kind of what the consequences of this are going to be financially for Pakistan. But this will essentially end up resulting in Pakistan being a client state of China, and that this will be a problem in the long term. So I think there are different views. It's not just going to be a difference I think there's going to be potentially a difference between the US and India on this, but also I think there are different views. I think Afghanistan is less. The other thing that I haven't talked about as much, but where there is shared concern is terrorism, but that has also been on the part of China and India. But where China has pushed, and Andrew Small has written about this, and his book is worth reading, but also some of his writings, whereas China has kind of pushed Pakistan on some of the groups that have been attacking China, but kind of making that distinction and not asking them to go after, for example, groups that target U.S. troops or Indian facilities and citizens.
I had a question about Indian policy in Nepal and Myanmar, and I was wondering if you could talk about both kind of governance and service provision projects, but also the political relationships there.
So both have been, and particularly the Nepal relationship, just in the space of kind of the last couple of years, there's been a lot of up and down, changes in government. And you saw kind of India just after the earthquake try to kind of take the lead, kind of deliver humanitarian aid. But then there were some Nepalis who felt that India was being a little too public about this and trying to get too much credit, particularly, and I think the Indian media has some responsibility for that as well. It was a bit too rah-rah about things. But you did see the government kind of move quite quickly and try to kind of convey that this was something that India was going to help provide services of a different kind of rebuilding, etc. But also working with the Chinese. That was something that not just the US and India, but China, of course, contributed to. But then I think, it was kind of in terms of the governments, you saw a Nepalese government, and this is while the constitution was being developed, that India's stance was, which, you will have Indian officials say, for years, everybody's been telling us to do more or talk more about democracy. And here we were trying to get provisions for the protections of minorities in the Constitution. And now you're telling us all that you should stay out of kind of Nepalese affairs and look for a strategic perspective, this is a bad thing. But there were differences with the government. And it was really interesting to see China, which usually tries to stay, as much as it's involved economically, it'll support it understands the political landscape. We saw this with the Rajapaksa government and the stakeholders and how to persuade them. But you haven't seen too much kind of getting involved and trying to shape what a government looks like. And you started to see that happen. But then you saw India re-engaging, and I think now they're in a good place. We were talking about this earlier, that India and Nepal, there's a government there that is engaging with, in India, of course, also, they're different, it's a Rashomon thing, whether it was blockaded Nepal to put pressure or not. But you have seen now, I think they're in a place where there is a government that it is on better terms with. You've seen a visit that was quite successful. Still unhappiness about the kind of degree of implementation of some of the projects. But you also have seen the Modi government now kind of actually focus on that, including in terms of tracking implementation, trying to get the ministries, because some of this is just cross-ministerial, lack of coordination or lack of emphasis. And you're starting to see this in the foreign ministry, kind of taking the lead in ensuring that they do actually get some of these projects done. I think also Nepal has understood as well at the end of the day that whether, whatever, yes, it can have China, but, India, the borders with India are where things come through. And so you have seen I think India and Nepal are in a better place. I think on Myanmar, you can argue that not enough has been done, but you've seen close cooperations on things like counterterrorism. You probably followed some of the kind of action on that front. I think the kind of insurgency groups, which you've of course written about in a broader context, but I think there has been cooperation on some of that front. There is a call, and you've seen the Indian government try to, not state-owned companies, but try to even facilitate Indian private sector investment in Myanmar. Not just Myanmar, but that's one of the major ones, but the what they call the CMLV, the Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, there's very minimal activity in at least Cambodia and Laos, so it's really Myanmar and Vietnam. Vietnam had also started to happen. You saw some private sector Indian companies announcing deals. I don't know if they'll still do it when it looked like TPP was going to be a reality, and for them, it was going to be an export base. And you've seen, I think, Aung San Suu Kyi was in India. And so you've seen as part of kind of this sub-regional, trying to move away from Sark as such, but these sub-regional groupings that you are seeing, whether BIMSTEC, under that, they had a national security advisors meeting recently, but also as BBIN, the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, trying to get some movement on that front. I think the other thing on Myanmar, which is worth watching, is how successfully India can complete some of the major initiatives on the connectivity side go through Myanmar. One is a India-Myanmar-Thailand road. My understanding is that the kind of sticking points right now are some of the bridges in Myanmar, which India is helping build, but also India trying to find another way to connect its east to its northeast through Myanmar, and the Kaladan project, which is worth watching out for. Depending on how, it'll be interesting to watch Sheikh Hasina's trip, because I think some of those initiatives depend on kind of the relationship with Bangladesh. So that'll be interesting to watch in the sense, have they got movement on some of the, especially the Teesta dispute, but also what India is going to put on the table given Chinese involvement there. I think that will also affect. Then there's the kind of complicated issue of the Rohingya, but that I will leave for kind of another discussion, and experts on that who know better. Please.
What role do you see for Sark vis-a-vis China, or how does China view Sark, or is it a non-entity, particularly in light of these dyadic-triadic relationships between India and China, Sri Lanka, for instance?
So the question back there was, where does Sark fit into all of this? Is China, how does China see Sark? Is there kind of a role for Sark? China is an observer state in Sark. There was a time where Pakistan and some countries, I think at one point Nepal and Sri Lanka, had said that China should be brought on as a full member, which, as you can imagine, India resisted, and it has to be by consensus, so that didn't go very far. At the moment, it's not so much kind of China's role in Sark, it's the fact that Sark has essentially stalled. You've seen Pakistan in some ways through CPEC, but also through some of its engagement with Afghanistan, essentially now tie its future with kind of and some of its engagement with the Persian Gulf as well, or the Gulf in general. You want to call it the Arabian Gulf, you can call it that. But that it's essentially kind of also not as connected to the rest of South Asia, and that India is also kind of going along with these sub-regional groupings. So it still exists. I think it's still the only forum where all these countries can engage. Having said that, the last meeting was not held because of kind of India and other countries saying that they wouldn't go to Pakistan after the attack on the Indian military base. And so I think at the moment, Sark, if it's not in cold storage, it's at least on the back burner for most of the countries. But China has been, had said in the past that it would welcome membership of Sark, and that it was actually seeking it, and it was not exactly refusing to become a member when others were putting it up. So if it comes back, I think one thing, whether or not India resists China being part of Sark, it is a South Asian, China is part of South Asia now in a way that it never was through its engagements with each of the countries. So even if it's not engaging, and you are seeing India, especially in the Indian Ocean area, try to kind of think about some of these other regional forums where China is not a part to try to get more going. But like it or not, whether it's in the Indian Ocean, whether it's in India's territorial neighborhood, it's a reality in almost every country.
What are India's main constraints, real and imagined, in trying to build leverage against China? And specifically, how do you rate India's foreign policy brain trust, the Indian equivalent of like Rand, Brookings, and so on?
That one can get me into trouble. Yeah. I think the question of leverage is really interesting, and I think this is one of the areas where I think a number of people, including my colleagues at Brookings India in New Delhi, are actually thinking through this question, which is how do you create, and it doesn't mean leverage in the sense that it's something you're necessarily going to use, but on the one hand, you can't create leverage if you don't engage. So you can't say, I'm going to use my market as an inducement if you're not going to actually potentially offer that market. So you could see tools in terms of economic tools. India has been quite actively using, and the Modi government has been using the Indian market as a source of leverage and you've seen this particularly in the energy space, but also as a consumer market with countries in the Middle East, for example. So I think you can. There is the economic side of it. The flip side of that is that I think on the strategic side, there's still an asymmetry in terms of what China can do in India's neighborhood versus what India can do in China's. Now, there are other sources of leverage, including India's partnerships with various countries. So you can either use it as leverage saying, well, if things aren't going great between us and you're going to push us, we're going to get closer. Or you can say, there's certain red lines that I will not cross if we continue to engage. So I think it's a really interesting question. It's some of the things that we're all thinking through. But you also don't want to think about leverage in a way that then actually reinforces the action-reaction cycle. And I think one of the other things is finding ways that you can actually also talk about the cooperative elements. So I think you can create positive and negative leverage, both carrots and sticks, and sometimes you can do it with the same instruments. I think it's a really interesting subject. I think the landscape in terms of think tank capacity, et cetera, has changed considerably since when I was growing up in India. You see government think tanks, you see government-supported think tanks, you see private think tanks, you see foreign think tanks that have set up Indian organizations and entities like Brookings and Carnegie. But you're not just seeing them in foreign policy, you're seeing them in economic policy, energy policy, environment. Just anecdotally, you're also seeing a greater level of government engagement with them. I think there are a variety of reasons for that. You're seeing, I think there is, for, everybody always says, oh, yes, there might be too much government in India, but government's very small for all the things that it needs to do in the foreign ministry, and not just in terms of numbers, but expertise, coordination capacity, even public engagement. So I think in some ways, government is seeing think tanks as a force multiplier in some senses, an ability to do certain kind of long-term studies, much like they do in DC, that government either doesn't have the time or the resources or inclination to do. You're also seeing the Indian government see these think tanks now as convening organization with the ability to convene in a way. I think they're also engaging because there's both thinking about using think tanks to get the message out, but also realizing that these think tanks, whether it's because of social media or writing, are also shaping the public debate. On the flip side, I think there's also still, and I think this could do with more government think tank engagement, because unlike Washington, and that's almost unique, where people go in and out of government, where there's a lot more day-to-day engagement, trying to get to that, not just creating proposals that are desirable but feasible as well, getting from the 30,000 foot to kind of the ground level and kind of talking much more about specifics. I think that we're going to see, and hopefully we will see more on this, where you are going to see kind of much more actionable and kind of exploring a whole different array of issues, regions. There's frankly, as much as I said, yes, there isn't enough knowledge of China, there's more knowledge of China than there is with a whole lot of other countries. So, lots of people, lots of publications on India, Pakistan, very few on India's with its other neighbors, for example. So you're seeing more of that. I think think tanks are spaces. So, I'm not just saying this to be diplomatic. I think it is a better place today than it was. And it's also a great place for, I think you're seeing a lot of younger people in the discussion as well. I think what I'd like to see is more discussion outside and more opportunities for centers and all outside Delhi to also be part of the discussion. It's happening, but it needs to happen more.
All right. On that note, Tanvi, thanks for coming to Chicago.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.